My name is Jeff Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, and I want to welcome you to our discussion on freedom or equity. What is the best path forward for America? Founded in 1995, the Russell Kirk Center seeks to educate the rising generations about the institutions, beliefs, and practices that are the foundations of Western civilization and the American experience within it. Named after Russell Kirk, the acclaimed author of The Conservative Mind and an influential scholar who was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by Ronald Reagan, and who the Michigan State Senate pronounced Michigan's greatest man of letters. The Kirk Center has achieved a national and, in fact, international reputation for advancing academic excellence and quality programming. Based in the village of Mecosta, Michigan, where Kirk wrote his important works, and is just 1 hour north of here. We encourage you all to come visit us sometime. The Kirk Center is a unique residential research and study center where students and faculty come for seminars or to reside for a period of time to conduct research and writing that can help advance their careers and also our understanding of first principles. Through all its programs, the Kirk Center aims to recover and renew those enduring norms and principles that Russell Kirk called the permanent things. The health of the family, inherited political institutions that ensure a measure of order and justice and freedom, a life of diversity and independence, humane learning, widespread possession of private property, the fashioning of a moral imagination, and the primacy of the transcendent in our lives. These permanent things draw us closer to the true, the good, and the beautiful, and they guarantee against the arbitrary interference by the state. They are all central aspects of conservative thought. Through its Kirk On Campus program, the center brings engaging and accomplished thinkers to campuses like Calvin to address some of the most pressing issues of the day through the lens of perennial ideas. And this is precisely our goal this evening. Before I introduce our discussion leader, I want to introduce our event coordinator for this evening, Emily Corwin. Emily, you want to stand and raise your hand? Emily's put all this together and did a fantastic job, and we thank her. She's also going to be in the back of the plaza entrance. There's a table. There's information on the Kirk Center. You can sign up for our newsletter, The Permanent Things, and Emily's otherwise here to answer any questions you might have logistically or otherwise. Well, on to the show. I want to thank, of course, Micah Watson for co-sponsoring this event, this evening's program. I want to thank his assistant, Ellen Heckman, for her help too. Wonderful help and indispensable. Micah is not from Michigan. He's a native of California, forgive him, where he completed his undergraduate degree at the University of California, Davis. He holds an MA and a doctoral degree in politics from Princeton University. As many of you students here know, he's the Paul B. Henry Chair in Christianity and Politics, and he directs the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program here at Calvin. He's a co-author of C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Natural Law, and he writes on a range of topics, including religious liberty, evangelicals and natural law, and morals legislation. He also is a contributing editor of Public Discourse, which I encourage you to read, Public Discourse, if you don't. Mike is on there frequently, and it's always an engaging place doing just what I described, engaging pressing issues of the day through the lens of perennial ideas, and Mike is a leader there. He and his wife, Julie, live in Grand Rapids with their 5 children, and Micah, you will take us away and introduce our guest discussant for this evening. Great.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for getting us started. I want to tell my students and other people here that the trip to Mecosta is worth it. I've taken students there, and the Kirk Center is a wonderful place to visit. I want to thank the Kirk Center for partnering with us. Not only are we partnering with the Kirk Center, but we are partnering also with Hope College, which will have a similar event tomorrow night. And if there's anything that can give us some promise in these polarizing times, it's Calvin and Hope cooperating on something together. 3 years ago, Calvin articulated a commitment to freedom of expression. I'm going to read you a snippet of that. In order for us to learn to think deeply and act justly in response to today's complex issues, we must first seek a fuller understanding of God's Word and God's world. That understanding is not enriched by sitting in comfortable echo chambers. Instead, we must enter into brave spaces with confidence that doing so will strengthen individual convictions by engaging differing viewpoints in communities that welcome diverse voices and perspectives into the conversation. Our mutual understanding grows when we listen to one another well and leave with deeper understandings of the issues and each other, even if our positions don't change. So I want to thank you tonight for coming, not so much to a safe space, but a brave space, where we'll talk about really important aspects of who we are individually and who we are together, and topics about which there is a great deal of disagreement, not only in our culture, but also on our campus. This is hard to do well because these issues are so important, but at Calvin we aspire to do it well, amidst so much noise and distraction and sound bites and owning that it can leave one feeling exhausted and defeated. So tonight, I'll introduce our speaker. He will talk for a little while. We'll have a conversation together, and then we will open it up for Q&A towards the end. So our guest this evening has been cultivating brave spaces for several decades and through a host of initiatives and positions, and time only permits me to offer a fraction of what he's been up to. For those of you who are Harry Potter fans, if you recall in the book or the movie when Hermione Granger can attend several classes at once with this time turner thing, you're going to wonder if our guest has one of those after I tell you what he's been up to. A proud product of the New York City public school system, Ian Rowe earned a BS in computer engineering from Cornell and an MBA from Harvard Business School, where he was the first black editor of the Harvard Business School newspaper. He served as director of the strategy and performance measurement for the Freedom Corps in the White House after 9/11, worked as a deputy director of post-secondary success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and for 10 years was the CEO of Public Prep, a public charter school network serving more than 2,000 students in the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. Oh, and by the way, he's also won 2 Emmys as a senior vice president with MTV. He is currently a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, the chairman of the board of Spence Chapin, one of our country's major adoption agencies, the co-founder with Bob Woodson of 1776 Unites, a visiting fellow at the, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, at the Woodson Center, co-host of the Are You Kidding Me podcast with Naomi Schaefer-Riley, and I just learned also involved with the podcast The Invisible Men, and the author of the forthcoming book due for release this May, Agency, which we'll touch on, I think, in our conversation tonight. He has academic chops, to be sure, but he's the furthest thing from being confined to an ivory tower. I am delighted to have him on campus. Would you please join me in welcoming Ian Rowe?
Well, Micah, thank you very much for that, that wonderful introduction. I hope to live up to the expectation that it sets. I'm really excited to be here. I understand that this is the first week that you've actually been able to go maskless on campus, so congratulations. It's good to see people's faces and smiles and make human connections in ways that have been very difficult over the last 2 years. So thank you for having me. I am looking forward to a rich discussion tonight. The idea of viewpoint diversity, the ability to have democratic discourse on tough issues, it is so crucial at this moment in our country that we are able to do that. And I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas that I have developed over 20, 30 years, both working in the ivory tower, as well as working on 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the heart of the South Bronx, and taking some of these ideas that we often pontificate about and bringing them into the real world with real people who are facing real challenges in their lives, and trying to get a better sense of just where are people coming from when there are such heated divisions and complete disagreement that we just kind of shut down listening to one another. And so I try to spend a lot of time trying to find the grain of truth in that person who is diametrically opposed to me or there, and that there's usually some common humanity which is the necessary starting place before we can go forward. As Micah said, amongst parts of my career, the elements I think that are most relevant are that for the last 10 years, I was the CEO of Public Prep, which is a network of public charter schools, elementary and middle schools, all girls and all boys schools, in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We had about 2,000 students, pre-K through 8th grade, almost all low-income students, almost all Black and Hispanic students. We had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list. It's an extraordinary day, the lottery, because parents just submit their name and it's literally a random lottery. And it's a wonderful thing when we call hundreds of parents to say, your child got the golden ticket. They got the pathway into our school. But then we have to send nearly 5,000 messages to parents to say the best we can do is put your child on an excruciatingly long wait list. And you really start to sense, what does it mean if by random luck of the draw, you're in the category where you get into the school that your parents really want, or you're now relegated to go to a school in a district in the South Bronx, District 8 in the South Bronx, where of the students that started 9th grade in the year 2015, 4 years later, only 2% graduated from high school ready for college, meaning that they started 9th grade and either dropped out somewhere along the way, or they did earn their high school diploma, but still could not do math nor reading without remediation if they were to actually go to college. You just think about which is worse, that you start and you drop out, or you do what you're supposed to do and still you're not able to be successful. So it has really forced me to think critically about what are the environments that we're creating for young people to have a sense of possibility if they're growing up in environments like that. And unfortunately, it's not just in the South Bronx where you see some of the numbers that I'm talking about. So I decided after my 10-year career running public prep, running schools through 8th grade, that I can't just be a fellow at American Enterprise Institute, which is an amazing organization, but I've got to go back in. So I'm launching a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools, also in the South Bronx, with the first campus to open in August. Because again, and our school is going to be grounded on the principles of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and our common humanity. And so I don't want those to be just words. I want to build an institution that demonstrates how do you operationalize that? Because I think one of the reasons that we have such difficulty in discourse today is that there aren't enough institutions that are carrying out, probably like Calvin, that are carrying out that statement of freedom of expression. How do you actually do that in a way that inspires people, that isn't just virtue signaling, but is real? So that's something that I will be doing. I'm happy to talk about how we're operationalizing it. But just to sort of step back, in my observations, certainly over the last decades working with young people and really accelerated in the last few years, I've come to this belief that there are these two meta narratives that I think are really holding young people back and their sense of possibility. And the two meta narratives I describe as blame the system, and the other is blame the victim. In the blame the system narrative, that's a framework that posits that America is forever an oppressive nation. That based on your skin color, your gender identity, based on some immutable characteristic, you are either an oppressor or you're oppressed. You're either marginalized or you are a marginalizer. That there are forces so strong, even capitalism itself is evil. That these forces are so strong, so discriminatory, so rigged, against you that you as an individual are powerless to overcome unless there's some kind of massive government intervention to really save you. So that's what I call the sort of, and there are lots of examples that I can give of why I believe this narrative is so dominant today. But on the other side, so that's to blame the system, but on the other side, I call blame the victim. In this narrative, it's almost exactly the opposite. America is this incredible country where the streets are paved with gold. It's a land of opportunity. That if you're not successful, it's your fault. There's some pathology that you have that has made it so that you have not taken advantage of the opportunities that exist in this country. You should have pulled yourself up by the bootstraps. So that's blame the victim. And in my view, both of these meta-narratives are debilitating from young people because they rob you of agency. The idea that you can actually control your own destiny. And I've developed my own definition of agency, which I put forth to you as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So in a sense, agency is like a vector, it's like velocity. So velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So the question is, if every one of us has the force of our free will, how is it that we have the capacity to be morally discerning about how we deploy that free will? And I've come to the conclusion that young people today need a new framework that helps them realize that they can overcome the institutional barriers that the system advocates constantly say are paralyzing, while simultaneously creating a framework where young people know that there are institutional supports that can provide the kind of resources that the victim folks constantly ignore. And so I've created this framework around 4 pillars that I think are crucial to young people's development and to create what I hope is an empowering alternative to these debilitating meta-narratives. And these 4 pillars I describe in this construct of free: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Those 4 pillars, if more young people were to embrace these institutions, I believe we would have a society that would be embarking upon a new age of agency, where more young people would have a life of possible human flourishing. The first F, family, it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. So many students in the schools that I run are from very challenged family situations. That doesn't always mean that it's a negative outcome if they've got a single mother or other issues, but oftentimes it means that they're part of a very fractured environment growing up. But it's very important that every young person understand, regardless of the family structure that you're from, you have control or some level of control over the family that you form. And so we'll talk a little bit tonight about something called the success sequence, which some of you may be familiar with. That is data that shows if a young person finishes just a high school degree, gets a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, marriage first, 97% of the people who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. It's not a guarantee, but it's certainly information young people should know as they embark upon making their own decisions as they enter young adulthood. The second part of free is R for religion, and it's wonderful being here on Calvin because clearly this institution recognizes the importance of a faith commitment in one's life. But unfortunately, we're at a time where religiosity is in decline, particularly amongst young people. And so I'm hoping to some degree, almost have a reawakening where more young people recognize the empowering force that a faith commitment can play in their own lives and not have the natural yearning for human connection actually be filled by false religions, whether that's kind of a woke religion. We can talk about some of these things that in today's world you're being excommunicated for because you're not adopting the full ideology, whether that's anti-racism or some of these other tenets that in some ways have almost replaced the role of a core faith. And again, we'll talk about that. E in free is for education, this idea that every young person should have the power to choose a great school for their child. So those 5,000 families who are on the wait list in the heart of the South Bronx, it's simply un-American and unfair that they are relegated to going to schools that for generations have produced these kinds of outcomes. And then the very last E is about entrepreneurship. It's about work, but it's also about something more. It's about this idea of being a problem solver, an entrepreneur in business, in social settings. How do you build wealth in all of its definitions? You know, in the Vertex Partnership Academies, one of the things that we're going to be doing with our kids, with all of our ninth graders coming in, is that through a partnership with Charles Schwab, the investment firm, every student will actually have a stock portfolio through something called the stock splits. If you're familiar with this, for $5 you can own a piece of Apple, a fractional share of Apple or Walmart or Google. And the idea is that each young person will have a portfolio of 10 S&P 500 stocks, where they'll get a sense of not only if you have an iPhone that you're a consumer, but you can be an owner. And what does that mean? How does that help young people understand, A, how the world works, but also that there are multiple facets of what it means to be a producer in our society. So these are the elements of free that I have, I'm hoping to put forth as an empowering way, and we can talk about how it's operationalized, as an empowering way in which young people just think differently about their lives, and to have a defense against some of these meta-narratives which are trying to really, in my view, constrain your sense of possibility.
Thank you. It's a great start. First question I have for you is about the title of tonight's event.
Yes.
So I find sometimes we have these terms that are around, they're in the water, everyone's using them. You mentioned anti-racism, we might want to discuss that. Calvin has a institutional commitment to what we mean by anti-racism, which may not be the same thing as what you were referring to, depending on how that works. But our title tonight seems to put freedom in opposition to equity. Equity seems like one of those things that's like, goodness, like why would someone be in opposition to equity?
Right. Who could be against equity?
Who could be against equity? So if we could put there we go, we have a visual up there for us. In some of your writings or your appearances, you have been critical of some versions of equity. Could you walk us through your take on that?
So can everyone see this chart? Are people familiar with this chart? It's probably one of the most shared images on the internet, and certainly within K to 12 education. Because as we were promoting this event, there are many people on Twitter and others said, this is such a terrible title. True freedom can never be achieved unless equity is achieved. And again, it's important to meet people where they are, because, okay, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by freedom? What do you mean by equity? You can't immediately get into an argument if you literally have completely different definitions. But the reason I thought it was a great title is that the word equity in particular, generally, the definition has really morphed, in my view, over the last several years, but it's really embodied by this chart. And I think it's actually worthwhile spending a few moments on looking at what this chart says, because it's incredibly powerful. So on the left, you see three people of differing heights, and that's a symbol for any immutable characteristic, right? That could be race, that could be gender, it could be any characteristic that you can say is inherently superior or inherently inferior. And yet in this chart, each of the three people has a singular box of equal height. And so you can see that the outcome is that they have different vantage points into the baseball game. And so that seems unfair because the shortest person is just looking at the wall, right? And so equality inherently in this picture seems like a bad thing because not everyone is getting the opportunity to see the game. That's bad. So what's a better solution? Well, this equity seems to be the solution because now everyone has a chance and they're almost all equal in height and they all have the ability to see the game. And so how is that achieved? Well, something that's very subtle but important. Notice that the first box under the tallest person has been removed. And the shortest person has had two boxes placed on them. If you're familiar with neo-Marxist ideology, there's a phrase that I remember first reading in Atlas Shrugged with John Galt: from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's a foundational statement that suggests in a society structured around this definition of equity, someone, usually some kind of totalitarian government, is making those decisions. Based on this immutable characteristic, you automatically are going to have resources taken away from you because you're in the privileged class, and you automatically are going to have resources given to you because you're on the unprivileged class. And so equity in today's parlance is usually defined as the absence of difference or equal outcomes. And I argue in a free society, we cannot have equal outcomes. What we have to strive for is this idea of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and a recognition of our common humanity. What's interesting is that in a school setting, so I run schools, every day I have situations where I have students with differing characteristics, different heights, different aptitudes, different everything, because we're all individuals, we're all human. And so it's not that every box is exactly the same in terms of the supports that we provide. We call them differentiated supports. And so the idea is that you create the kinds of resources for each student, not based on, well, you are black and so therefore you must get X, or you're this and therefore, it's not that. And so the idea is, how do you create equality of access, equality of opportunity for all kids? That, for me, is the fundamental element of freedom. Freedom to be able to perform at all levels with no guarantee of outcomes. On one level, it may seem heartless, but in my view, it's the most moral sense of how we create an environment for human flourishing. So that's one of the reasons I think that we decided freedom versus equity, particularly the way equity is currently defined, are at odds with one another.
I wonder if we think about, you're hoping to provide more access to those 5,000 kids who can't get in. What would an equality approach look like that with regard to that problem, as opposed to the equity approach that you would find more problematic?
Yeah, well, what's interesting first of all, it's very hard to put everything into a cartoon. This is one of the challenges, right? That we try to boil these incredibly difficult concepts into these single images. I will admit this one is pretty powerful in doing that for equity. But if I were trying to draw this as it relates to, let's say you mapped out those 5,000 plus kids and the couple hundred that are getting in, and you had schools, what I'd want to have is, instead of having one school with a couple hundred students and 5,000 waiting, I would have many schools on this chart so that parents would be able to choose the school that they think is right for their child. I mean, the irony is that school choice, as we often talk about, or parental choice in education, has widespread acceptance in today's world. I would imagine most of the students in this room, I can only guess, but I would imagine that you benefited from, and this isn't, and when I say you benefited, I'm not saying to say that you should feel guilty or that you're privileged, because every child should be privileged, but my guess is your parents were able to choose a K-12 education that they thought was fundamentally strong, aligned with your values. Maybe you went to a public school. I went to New York City public schools and got a great education. Maybe you went to a private school. Maybe you went to a religious education. But the aspect of choice likely, again, I can't know everyone in the room, but likely played a choice. And that exists for many middle and upper class kids, and yet for low income kids, it generally does not. And so I share the frustration that many sort of blame the system advocates have in that, see, it's the system that's holding these kids back. That's an element that I actually would concur, and that we need to make school choice much more a norm that exists in our society. And so these are the kinds of examples I try to find, those points of intersection, where even though we may disagree on your definition of equity, I do believe that if you're in a situation where you're a 24-year-old mom who may have had a child early and may have made whatever mistakes she made in her life, but wants her 5-year-old's trajectory to be different, we should give her and her child that option.
Yeah, I wonder almost if, so we're talking about a scarcity. We want to, this is just this one picture, we want to make it this much bigger. We want to expand it beyond those boundaries.
Abundance.
Right? Yeah, okay.
A theory of abundance, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the things that often frustrates me about blame the system and blame the victim ideology. It's almost always this sense of it's a zero-sum game, that there's a limited pie, that in order for this group of kids to succeed, that must mean this group of kids must sacrifice in some way. And I think America has always been built on this idea that if you give each individual person the kinds of supports that I believe will come through family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, the pie grows. That's the fundamental philosophy.
So some people in our country act as if the legacies of our history, in particular our racial history, are ancient history, not something we still grapple with, as if we don't see any racial disparities that stubbornly persist. These might align with the blame the victim side of things, perhaps. It seems there's others on the opposite side of the spectrum for whom the lens of race and systemic or structural racism is the dominant paradigm by which to understand everything about America then and now. It strikes me those folks might be more aligned with the blame the system. With that in mind, I want to read you a quip from former South Bend mayor and our current Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and see how you would react as to what he gets right and what he gets wrong in terms of these two different ways of seeing. It says, "We know that the generational theft of the descendants of slaves is a part of why everything from housing to education to health to employment basically puts us in two different countries." This narrative that we have, there are two Americas, which sometimes we hear every 4 years in our political discourse. What's right about that, or what insight you sympathetic with there, and what's less so?
And I would imagine his two Americas are along racial lines, given that's the implication of that statement.
Right.
So we have to have the courage to talk about these things, right? So a few years ago, the New York Times had a special magazine issue called the 1619 Project, where they essentially took this view that virtually every aspect of contemporary America is pretty much explained by the history of slavery in our country, where in fact, even the country's founding of 1776 is a falsehood. The true founding was 1619, when the first slaves appeared on our shores, that the country was founded as a slaveocracy and not a democracy, that the founding principles themselves were, quote, false when they were written. And that ideology has very much taken hold. And so someone will say, for example, if you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, which is it's done every couple of years, it's kind of the Bible to kind of understand what is the average wealth in our country for certain groups. So in the 2019 survey of consumer finances, it found that the median wealth of the average white family was about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average black family. And so for some people, that is proof of this legacy. In fact, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the author of the 1619 Project, she wrote an 8,000-word essay in the New York Times Magazine called What We Are Owed. And it's a treatise on the fact that the only way that black people can succeed in this country is if the government passes literally a $13 or $14 trillion reparations program. And in fact, in the essay, she says, there is no action a black person can take. It doesn't matter if you save, doesn't matter if you get an education, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you get married. None of those actions can overcome, quote, 400 years of racialized plundering, end quote. Now imagine if you were a 12-year-old black kid in the Bronx and you hear that language. And she's not the only one. There's a lot of this kind of messaging. It's a lot of blame the system where you're sort of helpless, right? Unless the government steps in. So a couple of points. One is Nicole Hannah-Jones has done virtually all of those things in her own life, right? And is leading quite a prosperous life. And you'll actually find that many people who are often criticizing America for all its faults are doing very well in their own lives, following principles around faith, family, hard work, free enterprise. So there's a hypocritical element of it. But this is what I'd say to Pete Buttigieg, which is that if you look at that same data, go back to the 2019 survey of consumer finances, and look at just two other factors, family structure and education, you'll actually find that the median wealth of a married, college-educated black couple is about $220,000. Guess what? Almost exactly $160,000 more than the median wealth of a white single-parent family. So why is that important? Well, the reason that's important is that, this racial wealth gap that we often talk about, which is proof of this country's long history of oppression and present-day oppression, is actually reversed when other factors are taken into account. So maybe that means that race isn't necessarily the predominant factor. And this is very important when we're speaking to young people, because if you listen to the blame the system ideology with this defeatist narrative, you will never ever get the impression that my level of education, my decisions around family structure, we can talk about the role of faith. There's actually a great article in today's New York Times, unbelievable, about a new book called God, Grades, and Graduation, which talks about the importance of having a faith commitment to improve academic outcomes. So that's what I'd say to Pete Buttigieg, this narrative of that's just the way it is, because there's almost no way out. It's a suffocating narrative for young people. And by the way, it's a suffocating narrative not only for black kids, it's a suffocating narrative for white kids too. If you are constantly being given the impression that you are an oppressor or responsible for past actions, how do you have agency in your own lives? So this kind of narrative I find honestly very destructive, and when it's coming from the highest levels of government, it's even more so debilitating for young people, in my view.
So I can imagine some of my students, I'm going to try and voice a pushback here, which is, okay, let's say that the Buttigieg position goes too far and can be destructive insofar as it sets this mindset and then it's stuck, right? But the other mindset is, hey, you've already mentioned this in your opening remarks, this country's done nothing wrong. right? That the bad we might have done some bad things, and there was that Japanese internment, but that's a long time ago, and slavery, and as if, are there still, or how do you answer the question, what does persist?
Yep.
Because it seems like there are those disparities, even if as we shift the variables with family, that they're be less than they are, but redlining wasn't that long ago, those sorts of things. So how would you respond to the folks who say, hey, everything's been great for a long time? And
right, and as I said, both narratives are debilitating, because both narratives, in my view, are half-truths that add up to a lie, right? So you can't say that America is without fault, but here's the thing, you have to put it into context. Tell me almost any nation that didn't have slavery in some form, oppression in some form. That doesn't absolve our nation of our history, but it is important to understand that slavery, unfortunately, is part of the human condition that, by the way, exists today. Should we go to China and look at the situation with the Uyghurs? And I mean, it's all over. So it is important, I think, to share that context. So when the New York Times 1619 Project came out, a group of black leaders, I joined Bob Woodson, who's an incredible civil rights leader, to say, what should we do about this? Because they're not entirely wrong that there were episodes in American history that have been horrific, but it's just incomplete. So the 1619 Project, they were not satisfied with just having a magazine issue. They decided to craft a curriculum which started to teach these ideas that the true founding was 1619, not 1776, and it was adopted in some of the poorest performing school districts across the country. Buffalo, Rochester, Chicago, where in some of these districts you literally have single-digit proficiency rates, right? Imagine, less than 10% of kids are reading at grade level. And so we said, you know what, rather than just shout in the rain, you fight bad ideas, or you fight ideas that you disagree with, not by canceling, not by shouting down, but introducing better ideas. So we said, well, then let's create something called the Woodson Center 1776 Unites curriculum, which in our view tells a more complete history of the African American experience in the United States. So here's an example, the Tulsa Massacre, which last year we celebrated the 100th anniversary of this terrible event in American history, in which in Tulsa, Oklahoma, what was considered Black Wall Street was essentially burned to the ground. Many people were killed. And for many of the sort of blame the system folks are saying, yes, kids are not learning about the true history of this country, and it's probably true. So what we said was, let's tell that story, but let's tell the whole story. So we start our curriculum unit on the Tulsa Massacre, starting with the incredible levels of entrepreneurship and black wealth that was built in this time of severe racial discrimination. And how is that happening at such incredible levels? Then you cover the fact that there was incredible resentment and this Tulsa Massacre and the burning down of the town. And then you also cover the period of resiliency and rebuilding. From our perspective, that is a more complete way to tell the entire story, where you're not cherry-picking the most negative elements and only focusing on that, nor are you sanitizing to say America is great. And so we try to answer that by saying, yes, we have to meet people where they are when they're saying they're not seeing stories of American history, the more negative elements represented in curricula. Let's talk about that. But let's not start with the position that the only history that's worth being told is a history that paints the country in this narrative of fatalistically oppressive.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, too, that in Hannah Nicole Jones's opening, she talks about the puzzlement she had with her dad,
who was
a patriot and raised the flag, and she didn't understand, given some aspects of the country's history, how that could be, and that's what kind of fueled her, part of what fueled the project in the first place. Well, that's good. I was going to ask you about that, the 1776 Unite, so you preempted one of my questions. I've heard you in another venue looking back at 1619 and 1776, but also you've asked this question, what happens if we look forward? So if we think forward now to 2076, the tricentennial, right? What will we see then if we've known that we've done good work now to lay the foundations for a more free, more just society, whether it's race or class or these different things? What are some of the, what would we hope to have accomplished? It seems like a long ways from now, and it is, but tell us what you would hope to see in 2076 if we have done our work well. Us,
yes,
more mature folks, and also our students and people in this room.
Yeah, it's really up to the students in this room and your children. There's a great short story, oh my gosh, by Kurt Vonnegut, that predicts a world in 2881. The name will come to me. You may know it.
Is this the
Harris Bergeron?
Yeah. Okay.
So if you haven't read Harris Bergeron, or Harrison Bergeron, I think, read this story. So in 2081, after many amendments to the Constitution, everyone is equal. Everyone is equal by law. And so Harrison Bergeron is this very tall, lanky, very good-looking, very well-spoken young man, but because everyone is equal, he has to wear shackles around his legs so that he can't walk as quickly as others. They've put these devices on his teeth so he's not as attractive when he smiles. He has to wear these weights because he's very strong, so he has to have these weights around him so he can't be stronger than anyone else in society. It's a really incredible short story, and like with many, it takes things to the extreme, but it makes a point that what is it that we're striving for when we are obsessed with this idea of equal outcomes? And if you read the story, he ultimately breaks free because the human dimension, the human condition, the human desire is to be free. And so he breaks out of these shackles. I mean, he meets his demise, but there's a moment where he kisses a ballerina who was also shackled because of her ability to dance and her beauty. And you can just see that this is not a world that we want where we're impeding human flourishing. We need to live in a world in which we are unleashing human flourishing. So my hope over the next 50, 60, hundreds of years is that we recognize the individual dignity that exists within each of us, that we stop this madness that I think is existing in our country today, where you're no longer a human person, you're just an avatar for some marginalized group or a marginalizing group. You have no identity other than your gender or your race or your gender expression or some other immutable characteristic. That is a road, in my view, to the very antithesis of what America promises. And my hope is that young people in this room, even if you disagree, have the ability to have discourse around this topic. Because what has been happening is not only are we, in my view, going down a direction I think that is harmful to your respective futures, is that we've lost the ability even to debate these topics. And that is what you have to hold dear. We talked about, John McWhorter has a great book out now called Woke Racism. If you haven't read it, it's a good read, where he essentially says that the anti-racism movement as defined over the last few years has become a religion unto itself. You can be excommunicated if you don't adopt every single tenet of what anti-racism means in the current context. That's a road to despair, and it doesn't deliver what I think the people who are advocating for these things promise.
Well, I think I have time for maybe one or two more questions, then we'll open it up.
Yeah.
In my classes, sometimes I will highlight this incredible disparity between a particular public policy concern and the personal connection students have to it. The concern is demographics in terms of birth rate. And how many countries are struggling a great deal with a low birth rate? You mentioned forming families, families being important, and yet, as important as that is for public policies like Social Security, like all sorts of, for an economy, particularly if you're in favor of a more expansive welfare state, you better be a natalist, right? But the last thing I would ever do, and my students, because I haven't done this, is say, all right, we're going to be talking today about why you guys need to have lots of kids.
Why wouldn't you do that?
Because I think I get in big trouble, and I'm scared.
Who would you get in trouble with?
I think I get in trouble with some students, perhaps, who would feel like I was intruding on a personal thing. I was going to ask you about this. You're turning it back on me, which is very clever.
No, I'm going to share. I'm going to share my.
So I wanted to
here.
invite you to because you have talked about family being important, and cultural renewal is something that you're interested in, and family formation is part of that. And I'll probably need to answer this question for my students later this week in class. But how would you address that with the people we have in this room and to the place? Why should we consider our personal choices about family as yet having a pretty important cultural and social dimension?
So imagine, as difficult as it is having this conversation with 20-year-old college students and trying to have the same conversation with 13-year-olds in 8th grade. So I'm familiar with this challenge. I'll tell a quick story and then why this has become so important, because I wasn't this guy who talks about family structure as central to human development. I mean, it's important, but it wasn't my thing. I thought we should just run great schools. That's the number one thing, it's the common pathway to opportunity. I had a great public school education. So I was running public prep, this network of schools, starting in 2010. But then in 2016, we saw that there was incredible demand for our schools in the South Bronx. We were in the Lower East Side and the South Bronx, but clearly the demand was there, so we wanted to open new schools, all in the South Bronx. So we decided to move our headquarters from Tribeca, which, if you know Manhattan, very cool, like very chic part of Manhattan, right on Broadway and Chambers, to 148th Street and 3rd Avenue, where there's a needle exchange on the corner, right? Right in the heart of one of the most challenged neighborhoods. In fact, 2 of the 5 congressional districts sort of crisscross there, 2 of the 5 poorest congressional districts in the country, given the level of density of poverty that exists there. So it was a big deal for our team to move there because there was some discomfort, because literally we had addicts walking by our front door. But we said, look, this is where our students are. Our kids in this community have hopes and dreams just like everyone else, and if we're going to build great schools in this community, then let's have our headquarters be in this community. So we decided to do a walking tour of the neighborhood just to get to know, where's the local deli, where's the local bank, just so we can acclimate ourselves. And so as we're walking on 149th Street, now on 3rd Avenue, we see in the distance this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck. And there are all these people standing around it, adults, very excited that this truck is there. Like, what is that? As we get closer to the truck, we see that the graffiti lettering says, "Who's your daddy?" Like, what is that? Who's your, I thought it was like the ice cream truck. But it says, "Who's your daddy?" Well, it turns out the "Who's your daddy" truck is a mobile DNA testing center that low-income folks are spending somewhere between $350 to $500 to answer questions such as, could you be my brother? Are you my father? Very profound and fundamental questions about identity, about your family. And honestly, that was a turning point moment for me. That it wasn't enough just to try and run great schools. If our kids are growing up in an environment where basic questions around family identity, and as I did more research in this area, I found the non-marital birth rate in this community of the Bronx was 85%. And as I did more research in Chicago and Appalachia and parts of Los Angeles and Buffalo and Rochester and all these towns where you often see high levels of poverty, high levels of crime, you also saw very, very high levels of non-marital births, particularly amongst women 24 and under. And so I just said, regardless of the family that you're from, we have to help young people understand the series of decisions in their own lives that can yield different and better outcomes, or more likely yield better and different outcomes for them. And so that's when I really started to spend a lot more time talking about family structure, and I discovered the data associated with what I said earlier, the success sequence. So high school degree, full-time work, and if you have children, marriage first, 97% of people who follow those decisions avoid poverty. Well, I tried to teach that in 8th grade, not as a prescription, but description. Massive pushback. You can't teach that to these kids because many of their own parents did not follow the success sequence in their own lives, and so you will be embarrassing these kids. You will be patronizing. You will be insulting them. So we shouldn't teach it at all. And so I took the position, wait a minute, you're saying it's better to deprive the very young people who need this information the most about what the rewards or consequences are associated with different series of life decisions. And it has been a battle, but one of the things we did was, facing this opposition, I said, you know what, before we teach the kids, let's have discussions with 8th grade families and parents before. And these were amazing sessions where we'd say, you know, you chose our schools because you believe that we are going to provide your kids with an incredible education to make good decisions in their own lives. Well, guess what? There's this thing called the success sequence, and we believe it's important that your sons and daughters know this, that within 8 years, they're going to be making decisions about relationships, work, and we think it's important that they know that here's one series of decisions that economically have this set of outcomes tied to it based on people who followed it. Here's another series of decisions that have this set of economic outcomes based on people. So it's almost like a probabilities chart as opposed to a prescription. But we found that that was a way to bring in this connection. And so that's how we talked about family structure. If you want to now have this conversation about, you know, birth rate, I think you should share it with your students. You know, you're about to graduate from college or graduate school. Within the next 4 to 8 years, you're likely going to be making decisions about relationships, about how you want to live your life. There are benefits to having children. There are also trade-offs if you're not prepared. I would just speak honestly with your students. I think we're in a moment right now that the fear of these conversations results in self-censorship before you even get to the conversation. You might find that a lot of your students are like, oh my God, thank God someone's saying it's okay, that it's okay to think about family. I feel like I'm not supposed to. Mm-hmm. I bet you many of your students yearn for the day where they can know that a strong family life is a part of who they are, and yet we're in a time where it seems that it's taboo to have those aspirations. So I think you should have more confidence, okay, not self-censor, take the risk, and then your leadership shouldn't penalize you.
Oh, leadership won't be, that'll be fine, yeah. But see, I got you to say it,
okay,
and you're leaving, right? And so then the students who do want to talk about that, we can have that conversation. So okay, it worked out just like I planned. All right, well,
just
thank you.
Show of hands, how many young people here are looking forward to that aspect of your life, which is building a strong family? Curious.
Okay. At this point, we are going to open it up to Q&A for those of you in the audience. I would ask that students, I would particularly encourage you to ask a question. But first, I'd also encourage everyone to ask a question. So that might mean a sentence of setup or two, but please no comments per se, but questions. And we have at least the one mic. So be brave. If you have a question, feel free to come on up and ask your question, and we'll see if we have a queue and try to continue the conversation. And please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Dave Corey. Thank you for your excellent presentation. First of all, my question goes to the title of your forthcoming book, Agency. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and its significance of that term?
So I do have a new book. Thank you for that. It's entitled Agency, and the subhead is empowering the rising generation to overcome the victimhood narrative and to discover your own pathway to power. That's the frame. And in it, I make the case that I've made to you, which is that throughout my experience at MTV, the Gates Foundation, the White House, running schools, and also just being a young person who, for a portion of my life, grew up in New York City and had a great education. And by the way, a child of parents that were married for 48 years before my dad passed away, right? That's also a very fundamental part of why I have the worldview that I did. My parents were also immigrants to this country from Jamaica, West Indies, so in the 60s. So they came here when there was a lot of racial tension, and yet they still were able to see a vision for what was possible for them and their two sons. And so in Agency, I try to share a lot of personal anecdotes, some of which I've shared tonight, but to set up this dichotomy that seems to exist, where young people are trapped between these narratives. And it's just so weird, whether it's young people being told that, you want a family, that's not so cool, or that the system is rigged against you, or it's actually your fault. All these narratives, where's the empowering message? Where's the message that lets young people know this is what's possible, and it's not just go do it, just go pull yourself up by the bootstraps, because that's not sufficient. That's cynical, right? I think that's where the victim ideology hurts kids too. Kids need support. Agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered, right? And so the question is, where does that social empowerment come from? Family, religion, education, and then once you have the forces of family, religion, education, entrepreneurship hopefully is a tool that you use to solve problems in your own life, build wealth, establish work, all of those things. So that's what Agency, so I put forth this framework as my solution, my alternative, because often I find in these discussions when we have a clash of ideas, it's just a clash of ideas. There's not well, what if we did X? And my hope is to surround young people with a new framework for how they can think about their lives. And that's what I put forth in Agency.
I wasn't hoping to stand up. My name is Bill Stevenson, formerly professor at Kelman College when I left. But anyway, thank you for coming and for your talk. One of the things that you said that really piqued my interest is the importance of religion. But of course, I think included in that has to be the importance not only of personal faith, but of a religious community. Because that's where the strength is. in my view. And in fact, 60, 70 years ago, there was such a thing as a very strong African American religious community, a very strong Hispanic American religious community. And you still see it in new immigrants, right? You still see that sort of thing in new immigrants. So I guess my question is there a way that your schools can sort of help students understand the importance of that aspect of their lives as they grow and develop?
It's a very good question. I would say to your point that in the past there were pockets within the African American community, or maybe more widespread or Hispanic, that there were strong religious communities. There still are. It's just that it's more narrow. And if you look at the data, there's a great study done a couple of years ago called "Black Men Making It in America," and it's one of the few studies that actually recognizes that there's a thriving black middle class. And are they just random? Are they such so insignificant? It turns out they're in large numbers. And this study analyzed what were the common factors that defined the behaviors associated with black men making it into the middle class or above. And guess what? Education, work, typically if they had children, they were married, and a faith commitment. That was one of the elements. And so this idea, but in most policy discussions, you almost never talk about faith. In fact, it's often one of these taboo discussions. And again, you're not supposed to talk about religion. The danger, I think, today is that the organic human desire for some spiritual connection still exists, but it's being filled by, in my view, the tenets of anti-racism, wokeness. Again, there's almost like a religious ideology, and frankly, there's also a religious community, because if you're on a college campus these days, if you're not down with the program, like there is a community of folks that are pressuring you into believing certain things about the human condition, and that it's all driven by racial discrimination or other forms of oppression. So again, that's why I'm really trying to push this idea of a true religious faith commitment. In terms of how to cultivate it, it's tricky, especially in a public school K-12 environment. And frankly, we are not sure yet how we're going to do it at the high school level, other than teaching about lots of different religions, talking about, there's lots of incredible studies that show what the difference is in your life condition if you have a faith commitment versus not. So, these things are tricky because, unlike a private school setting or a Calvin where I think you can speak honestly about what a faith commitment likely means in your life, in a public school setting, and I'm trying to push the boundaries as much as I can, I at least want to share the data that says, here are the likely outcomes in your life if these are the choices that you make.
Hello, my name is Calvin Cody, and earlier in today, Professor Watson in class said that you worked for George Bush. How did you do that, and what did you do? Because I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, so good question. So George Bush II. After business school, I went to work at Teach for America, which was the crazy thing to do. You go to Harvard Business School and then you go to work for this fledgling nonprofit. But I was inspired to do it. It's this kind of thing of, if you go to Harvard Business School, rather than believe that that has put constraints around you, I actually felt it liberated me to pursue the things that I was most passionate about. I hope that you look at your experience at Calvin in that way, that you're not now the social expectation is you must do X. It's actually giving you the freedom to choose the things that you're most passionate about. But after Teach for America, I then we partnered with one of my partners, Ian, and we created our own firm, Third Millennium Media, that did some great work around creating social activism around education, the environment. We did some really wonderful things. Then 9/11 occurred, and I was in New York City. Our headquarters were on Crosby Street in Soho, and so I heard the plane that came over, the first plane. And of course, I had no idea what it was, but it was this sound that's weird. And it was this incredibly beautiful day, cloudless sky, and then of course everything that ensued. And I felt our country was just attacked, and so I wanted to figure out a way to do something. And because my career at that point, I'd been to business school, I'd worked at Anderson Consulting, I'd done a lot of interesting work. The president said that he wanted to create a domestic response to 9/11. This was before there was a case being made for war in Iraq or the weapons of mass destruction. And so the president created a small office in the executive office of the president called the USA Freedom Corps. And the USA Freedom Corps, its mission was to take this moment in American history and mobilize the American spirit in terms of volunteer activity, whether it be in your own hometown or overseas. How do we take this terrible moment and translate that into the massive American character and show the power of our country? Long story, the president reached out to a mentor of mine. He recommended me, so I went to the White House in January of, this was February of 2002, right after George Bush had given his State of the Union address where he was announcing the creation of USA Freedom Corps. And so I was hired to be the director of strategy and performance measurement. So for 18 months, there was this incredible moment. That was the moment when actually we were together as a country. We organized, so part of my role was to organize something called Business Strengthening America. We had some of the biggest companies from Disney, AT&T, all these incredible CEOs to commit tremendous resources to empower their employees, to volunteer in places all over the world, to give time off, to engage their consumers. We worked with a lot of faith-based organizations. We actually created the first ever resource that allowed you to put in your zip code or any location around the world, and you could find other people in your community or around the world that wanted to connect with you on a given issue. It was amazing that we were able to, like, if you might live here in Grand Rapids and really want to work on crime reduction, but you don't know others, so you put in your zip code, and then suddenly you found other people who may have been 2 miles from you, but you had this ability to connect. So we built those kinds of resources. So it was an amazing time to be at the White House. At the same time I was there, that's when the case for war in Iraq was being crafted, and frankly, everything shifted, and I had the opportunity to go work at MTV to run all of what's called pro-social programming. So if you're familiar with like Rock the Vote or Choose or Lose or Fight for Your Rights, probably don't know any of this stuff because that's when MTV was cool. It's not as relevant anymore. Anyway, so that's what I did at the White House. I didn't expect it. And it's kind of a byproduct of when you make decisions in your life, in your career, to pursue things that you're passionate about. Opportunities start to come your way that I could have never envisioned that would have happened.
Hello. My name is Simone, and I'm a freshman here at Calvin, and thank you so much for your time, and it's been really interesting listening to you. I had a question concerning history and how it's taught in America, and you mentioned something like the 1917 project, and then of course there was the 1776 project that was brought by like Donald Trump and all these kind of things, and I feel like there's all these like narratives that you hear about like how history should be taught, and you have like critical race theory and all these kind of like, you know, here and there, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how history is taught in America, if there's a change, and what does that change look like in a way that's, bipartisan and charitable.
Yeah, it's a great. Yeah, how should we be teaching history? And when you start this, you have to be satisfied with the answer that it can never be complete, right? Because there's American history, there's world history, there's your own town's history, right? So there has to be some process where some group of people are deciding what's in and what's out. And there will always be some element that is out. I think it is fair to say that, by the way, if you look at the National Assessment for Educational Progress, this is the national assessment that's been given every 2 years for the last 40, 50 years. In the last national assessment in history, something like only 15% of all American kids even have a basic understanding of American history, American government. So we have a lot of work to do, even just understanding contemporary politics and how our government works. So there's that. But I do think the folks who, over the last few years, have hammered away at this idea that the parts of America that are not as positive probably should get more exposure. I gave the example of the Tulsa massacre, right? But again, it's got to be put into context of the entrepreneurship that happened, the massacre, and the rebuilding. We also have another unit that focuses on Booker T. Washington. Many people don't know that in the early 1900s, in the midst of the Jim Crow segregation, where black kids were going to schools that were terrible. They were under-resourced, terrible. But Booker T. Washington said, I have a vision for building a network of excellent schools. So he partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company. And together, getting matches from local communities, they built nearly 5,000 schools exclusively for black children throughout the segregated South. And the levels of achievement were unbelievable because you had great black teachers and community supports, and at that time, the marriage rate within the black community, the family was much stronger, incredible academic achievement. And ironically, why are there no Rosenwald schools today? Because the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case that we all love actually had the idea that separate must mean unequal and inferior. So here all these amazing 5,000 schools that were doing great work were deemed unconstitutional and had to close. Isn't that amazing? So that part of American history should be taught too. There's no easy answer to this question other than I think people have to come with a good spirit without the agenda, or I'm trying to show that America is truly an oppressive nation, nor that I only want to show America as this incredibly wonderful, it's got to be people who are coming with good spirit. And right now, unfortunately, that is harder and harder to find. But I have empathy for people who say not enough of our history is being taught. I just think the ways in which those people typically are going at it seem to want to fixate on those elements which are mostly negative. And I think tell the history of our country, warts and all.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm Carl Plantinga. I teach here at Calvin. I think at least 2, maybe 3 times you've compared wokeness or anti-racism to a religion. but you've also been promoting the importance of religion
Right.
in, creating successful individuals and, good family and a moral imagination and that kind of thing. So what is it about true religion that separates itself from wokeness or anti-racism or
Yeah.
other ideologies?
Yeah. Well, true religion probably has a few years on anti-racism, right? Critical race theory, these ideas have evolved over 30, 40 years maybe. I think Judaism, Buddhism have a few years on that. But in a sense, I'm being a little facetious, but that's what I mean. It's not, by the way, it's got to be Christianity or Buddhism or any specific religion, because again, you don't want to be prescriptive, but search out, read the Sermon on the Mount, read these, they're beautiful, and I think young people are losing the opportunity to know what those words and the community can mean if they start to follow those ideals. I think the reason I think John McWhorter and others are comparing, anti-racism and wokeness to a religion is that for many young people, in some ways, it actually is the religion that they have sort of really become exposed to. That, that America is an oppressive nation, that if you see a black person, that they're inherently marginalized, they're inherently oppressed. And if you don't have that point of view, there's a community that will punish you for not having those beliefs. And that is really dangerous. So they're both a religion in a sense, but when I'm saying the religion that I'm advocating for is much more along the lines of a true spiritual religion with a I would actually say a code, but in some ways anti-racism has a code as well. But in my view, true religion's built on something far more enduring.
Hello, my name is Josh Steinberg. I'm a freshman here at Calvin. So I thought your talk was very interesting, and when you were bringing up points about equal outcome versus equal opportunity, I guess my question is, there are very marginalized groups in America. We know that they tend to be minority groups, but it's not solely because of race. There's intersections with class, gender, religion. There's a lot of those. So my question is, how do you think power governors in America or implicit biases are still in effect today, and how do we combat those to create more equal opportunity, not necessarily equal outcome, but just because they're a reality, how do we combat those to create that equal opportunity?
Yep. So this is a very important question, right? If there are disparities in our country, right? There are by certain groups, and if you look through singular lenses, let's choose race, and you see, for example, there's a racial wealth gap, and that's the only dimension that you're looking at, then it is very easy to come to the conclusion, well, then it must be due to implicit bias or explicit bias based on race. But what that tends to do, because your theory of causality becomes singular along this one dimension, which then means your theory of action usually becomes singular based on this one dimension. So that's why you see, for example, an explosion in anti-racism training or anti-bias training, where imagine if we took everyone in this room and we lined everyone up in a horizontal line. And we said, and there's someone on the side, a professor, who says, if you're white, take 2 steps forward. If you're black, take 3 steps backward. And you go through a series of exercises. This is a real thing. It's called a privilege walk if you have not heard about it. But this is an example of the kind of privilege training that's supposed to educate people about their privilege or their oppression. So imagine at the end of this series of questions, you have a outcomes typically where you've got white men at the back and the front and a whole bunch of non-white poor people at the back because you're inherently oppressed, right? Those are the kinds of interventions, in my view, that hurt the efforts that we're trying to solve, because these disparities are not monocausal. We just have to accept that. It doesn't mean that systemic racism or other forms of discrimination doesn't exist. The question is to what degree. So on, what day is today? Tuesday, right? So yesterday, I was asked to be part of a newly formed commission on it's called the Commission on the Status of Black Men and Boys. It's a bipartisan commission. It's chaired by Senator Marco Rubio on the Republican side and Frederica Wilson on the Democratic side. And they were talking about the state of black men and boys, and honestly, the entire first section of this discussion was all about black men being killed by the police, black men being disproportionately affected by COVID, like all of these statistics where literally it's as if, gosh, I'm black, I should just stop right now because I clearly cannot overcome these statistics that they're saying. And but then when I got to speak, I said, there's a study done a few years ago, I mentioned it earlier, black men making it in America, and when you look at other factors like family, faith, hard work, free enterprise, if you look at immigrant communities, for example, recent immigrants from countries like Nigeria or the Caribbean, there are a lot of black people that are doing quite well to the point where they far exceed outcomes in the white community. So if our country is so systemically racist, then what is it that those groups tend to be doing, not everyone, but tend to be doing, that make them successful? And that's when in my view, can get to a much more rich discussion around the behaviors that distinguish someone who is being successful even in the face of these tropes of paralyzing discrimination. So then you start to say, most of these immigrant families, typically strong families, strong values around education, usually a faith commitment. You keep coming back to these core elements. So my work is trying to not dismiss concerns about racism, not dismiss concerns about structural forms of discrimination. The question is, to what degree are those forces debilitating, right? There is systemic racism, there's institutional racism, there's structural racism, but there's also surmountable racism. And so the more that we can help young people understand what those factors are, you can acknowledge that bias exists, but you also have to acknowledge that there are people, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't be fighting to reduce bias and all that, but we can help young people understand that they don't have to be a victim. This is why I've written my book. They don't have to be a victim, that there are decisions within their control that can overcome those biases.
Time has gone by, at least for me, rather quickly. So we have come to the end of our session.
Oh, we could go on.
We could go on. And if you're interested in keeping up with Ian, you could find him on podcasts and AEI and all sorts of things.
I'm all over the place.
But thank you for joining us. Thank you, all of you, for coming. On behalf of the Russell Kirk Center and the Henry Institute, would you join me in thanking Ian Rowe for joining us today?